Welcome everybody to the Museum of Native American History's 6th Annual Culture Celebration. I'm Charlotte Buchanan Yale, Director of the museum. It is our honor for the 2nd year in a row to welcome the Carolyn and Ora Smith Foundation for Indigenous Girls and Women in STEM, who's sponsoring this segment of our culture celebration. And it's my privilege to work for the last few years with Miss Mary Smith. I haven't gotten to hug her yet, and welcome Sarah Redfield. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you and Mary, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our panel. We are pleased to be part of the 6th Annual Cultural Celebration presented by the Museum of Native American History in Bentonville, Arkansas. Hello to everyone who is there in Bentonville today. The name of our panel is Indigenuity 2.0, Indigenous Science. What would it take to transform the world? We know that that's an ambitious title, but if you're not ambitious, you should be. So we are going to talk about a lot of topics today, but I'll start by saying that Native American people and Indigenous people are underrepresented in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematic disciplines. That's also known as STEM, S-T-E-M. According to the National Science Foundation, Indigenous people represented 1.7% of the United States population, but only accounted for 0.6%, that's 0.6% of bachelor degrees, 0.4%, this is less than 1% of master's degrees, and 0.2% of doctoral degrees in science and engineering. The low participation of Indigenous people in STEM disciplines has been attributed to reasons such as lack of exposure, lack of interest, lack of confidence, lack of sense of belonging, and a lack of goal congruency. Well, those may be some of the issues. We're going to actually talk about another one today that is, I think, a significant factor, which is both explicit and implicit bias. And I am Mary Smith. To introduce myself, I am president and founder of the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation. I am a member of the Cherokee Nation, and the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation works to support Native American women and girls in the STEM fields. I myself have a background in STEM. My undergraduate degree was in math and computer science, and previously I was the CEO of the Indian Health Service, which provides healthcare to over 2 million Native Americans across the country. It was actually after being the head of the Indian Health Service that I started the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation, because I saw how few Native Americans go into the medical fields, whether it's nursing, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, doctors, even information technology. So I wanted to do something that would make a difference. And little did I know, as did none of us, that the COVID pandemic would overtake the nation a few years later. And I think the lack of participation of Natives in the medical fields is part of the reason that Native Americans have been impacted more significantly than other members of the population. So as I said, the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation focuses on Native American women and girls. I just gave you some statistics about Native Americans in the STEM fields. I wanted to take a little deeper dive too about women. So again, according to the National Science Foundation, women remain underrepresented in science and engineering, although to a lesser degree in the past, with the greatest disparities occurring in engineering, computer science, and the physical sciences. So today, we are going to be talking about implicit and explicit bias that happens in the STEM fields toward women. And we will also do a little deeper dive on Native American women and girls. Today, our conversation is going to be inspired by a 2020 documentary, Picture a Scientist. And this documentary is available, and I urge all of you to watch it after our talk today, but we will give a little background on the documentary. So even if you haven't seen the film, you will be able to follow the conversation. So don't worry about that. So it's called Picture a Scientist. It's available on Netflix or Amazon Prime. So I will be joined today by Professor Sarah Redfield, a Maine native whose work centers around unintentional bias and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I will give a more robust biography of Professor Redfield later. But right now, we'll start with this conversation today. We'll start with an overview of unintentional bias and its impact on Native American scientists. Then we will move into broader topics of invisibility and the dangers of groupthink, which often silences the critical voices of diverse populations. And there will be ample time for questions and discussions with the audience. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end. But please feel free to send in questions during our discussion. We will be monitoring the chat, and I do understand that people at the museum have microphones as well. So it's meant to be a dialogue, so we look forward to hearing from you. So let me begin by describing a little bit about the film, because we're going to assume that most people have not seen it yet. It chronicles the groundswell of researchers who are writing a new chapter for women scientists. One of the main people you'll see and we'll discuss today is biologist Nancy Hopkins, chemist Rachel Burks, and geologist Jane Willenbrink. The three of them and others bring viewers on a journey deep into their own experiences in the science, ranging from brutal harassment to years of subtle slights. Along the way, from cramped laboratories to spectacular field stations, there will be discussions from scientific luminaries throughout. So again, as I mentioned, this panel is sponsored by the Caroline and Orr Smith Foundation. I've told you a little bit about myself. And before we begin the conversation, let me tell you a little bit about Sarah Redfield. She's a professor emerita at the University of New Hampshire School of Law, an affiliate professor at the University of New Hampshire College of Education and Women's Studies programs. She's a member of the Maine Bar, and her research and scholarship are focused on diversity and inclusion in the legal profession and along the educational pipeline. Her current work continues her longstanding interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and concentrates on implicit bias and strategies to interrupt that bias and reduce the negative consequences of its manifestations in legal, medical, education, and workplace environments. So now, let me tell you a little bit about three of the women you'll hear about us discussing today who are in the film Picture a Scientist. I mentioned Dr. Nancy Hopkins. She's a biologist and professor at MIT. And she begins in the film by describing her experience as a student working in James Watson's lab and being sexually assaulted by Francis Crick, one of Hopkins's heroes. She also describes later how, as senior faculty, she was seen as a technician. And key to her story is her trying to get larger lab space to accommodate her research with fish. Her fish needed large tanks in order to do her research. So when she first asked and was refused to get a larger lab, she explained that she had less lab space than the other male colleagues. And she was told, "Oh, no, Dr. Hopkins, that is absolutely not true." But she, being a scientist, took matters into her own hands, and she measured each lab with a tape measure to document that it was true. Her 1,500 square feet compared to the average junior male colleague, and mind you, she's a senior person at this point, of 2,000 and full professors of 3,000 to 6,000 feet. So that's a little intro about Dr. Nancy Hopkins. We also will discuss Dr. Jane Willenbrink, and whose experience was early in her career with the famed Dr. David Marchand in Antarctica. She was sexually harassed almost beyond imagination. There was name calling, demeaning, threatening, and physically throwing rocks at her and knocking her down a rocky hill. And the third woman we'll meet and discuss is Dr. Rochelle Burks, a Black chemist. She describes her own education as never knowing or seeing another Black female scientist. She also tells a story of being mistaken for the janitor and similar harassing and biased treatment. So, Professor Redfield, I wanted to start asking you, and this is a conversation, like I said, everyone, please, if you have questions, we would love to take your questions. The Boston Globe has described this film as, quote, quietly devastating. Do you want to kind of start and kind of level set us about what we're going to discuss today?
Yeah, thanks, Mary, and thanks for that great introduction. So the film is devastating, and I join Mary in urging folks who haven't had a chance to see it before the panel to watch it, because it's devastating in its description of the experiences of these women, but it's also, I guess I would say, has a pretty happy ending. So if you do watch it, be sure to get all the way to the end. Don't quit in the middle. I think the best place maybe for us to start comes near the end of the film, where Dr. Hopkins is talking with a fellow scientist, social cognitive scientist, Mahzrin Banaji. And Dr. Banaji is one of the people who, with Tony Greenwald and other colleagues, started us thinking about the implicit association test. And that's a test that measures how we respond to things implicitly. This is just a small aside so you can put her in context. So if I were to ask Mary if she were biased against women with disabilities, she would say no. I know you would, Mary. And she would mean it. She would mean it. And I would believe her. But it may be that implicitly, if she saw a person with a disability, her response might be different. So, for example, I walk with a cane and braces now. And when I go walking in my town, people cross the street not to be walking next to me. So, that's implicit. They wouldn't say they were biased against a person walking with a cane, but they don't want to see me either, right? So that's what we're talking about. And so Dr. Banaji discovered a way to find that out. There's a test. You can all go take it at the Harvard website. Just search Harvard and IAT and you'll find it. And it measures your implicit response. So not your self-reported response, how your brain is responding. So it's in that context that Dr. Banaji and Dr. Hopkins are talking. And Dr. Hopkins asked Dr. Banaji how it is that her male colleague, could say that he never saw discrimination against women scientists. And Banaji responds with some antipathy, I guess I'd say. And she says, well, that's just not an acceptable view anymore. It might have been once, but it's not anymore. And he may feel that way in his heart and his mind, but the data is too much. The data shows differently. And I think that that's the point that Mary made when she described the fish tanks and the measuring. I mean, Dr. Hopkins went into her lab secretly at night to measure the difference. So, the data that Mary gave us about how many women scientists there are and where the intersection of race and ethnicity in science comes with gender, that's the point, that the data is so omnipresent. And here's what I think is the real point for us to be talking about. Banaji says to Dr. Hopkins in that conversation, well, it's rough for women. It was rough for you, it's rough for me, it's rough for women scientists. But what's really the point of all this is we're missing half the intellect of the world. So if we take out of the equation 50% of the potential science thinking, then we have really just lost so much by exclusion.
Yeah, and so that kind of brings up the topic of invisibility. I know the women in the film faced huge barriers because of their gender and race. But could you describe a little bit about being invisible? And then I'll probably chime in because I know Native Americans often feel that way.
Right. So it's often the case for many of us, that we feel that we are just not seen. And I'm going to, before I say anything more about that, Mary, say that I had the privilege to work with you and Patty Ferguson Bonnie on a chapter of our book called Extending Justice, where we talked exactly about Native American invisibility. And I guess I'm not sure what the word is for not being heard. Maybe there isn't a straight, one word for that. And before I go on and talk about the movie, maybe you would just talk a little bit about what we discussed then.
Yeah, well, it wasn't specifically in the STEM fields, but previously I was president of the National Native American Bar Association, and we did the first and till this time the only kind of comprehensive study on Native American attorneys. And similarly, I mean, it's very similar to the statistics I gave in the STEM field. There are very few Native American attorneys. And what ends up happening is, and I'm sure this is the case in the STEM fields as well, since there are so few Native Americans in the practice of law, sometimes when they go to work in a law firm or a company, they're the only ones. And when they're the only ones, they feel invisible because they don't have people who have similar backgrounds or similar experiences than they do. And the other people in the workplace can't relate to them. So just exactly what you were saying, Professor Redfield, not only are they invisible through sight, because there's only one or two of them, but also their voice is not heard as part of creating the culture of the organization.
So Dr. Hopkins in the movie describes her own thinking about being invisible. And when she looked around and saw not very many women scientists, she at first explained it to herself by saying, well, it was just hard for women because being a scientist is so demanding. She, for example, had to be in her lab with her zebrafish 365 days a year. And she thought that would be an impossible thing to do and be a mother, and decided not to have children. But then she goes on to talk about how her thinking evolved, that maybe really wasn't the reason, or it certainly wasn't going to be the only reason why women weren't in scientists. And she described invisibility as a really critical reason. She said you would do experiments and you would publish them, and it was like you were invisible. Your work was invisible, what you said was invisible. And when I was watching her, I'm reminded of a couple of cartoons I want to try to describe to you. We made a really informed decision not to be doing PowerPoint, so I'm going to describe them to you. So the first one is a group of people, small group, 6 or so people sitting around a boardroom table. And so 5 of them are men and there's one woman. And the chairman of the board obviously is standing up and he says, "Thank you, Miss Triggs. Now we'll wait for one of the men to make that point." So I see Mary laughing. I expect that those of you in the audience are also laughing. But now I want to tell you that cartoon was from 1985, and we're still chuckling over it in a kind of uncomfortable way today. And I want to.
We've all been in meetings where a woman makes a point, and then
Exactly.
later in the conversation, a man makes a point, and everyone says, "Wow,
oh, what a good idea!
Great idea!"
Yeah.
And that still unfortunately happens.
So we recognize it, and that makes us laugh a little bit. But let's just want to say one more thing before we move on to my next cartoon example. I would like folks to be thinking about how Miss Triggs feels in that situation. You know, she is excluded, she is ignored, she is invisible, or might as well be. Someone else will get the credit for her idea. All of those things are true. And we know now that people feel those kinds of slights, if you will, bigger than slights, with the same pathways in our bodies and brains as we feel pain, physical pain. So Ms. Triggs is not doing well in that meeting, but I also want you to think about the rest of the men in that meeting, right? The one who said, "We'll wait for some other man." And he said that because he's waiting for somebody in his in-group that he can trust to have the idea. And then all the other men who also now think Ms. Triggs's ideas aren't worth hearing, right? So that's my first cartoon that I want to share with you. And then the second is a similar group. It's like, I'm sure some of the set up like a panel, a live panel like we used to have. And there are 4 men sitting there, and one of them says to the other 3, well, the subject of tonight's panel is why there aren't more women on panels at our conference. And so it's exactly how it happens, right? You are invisible. Nobody thinks to invite you, so you don't get invited. Who do they think to invite? They think to invite the people they'd like to have lunch with, or that they saw at the last conference, so it perpetuates itself. So I think this thing about invisibility is very real and very painful for women, and prevents the serious recognition of our work.
Well, and I did want to say that I think the museum is going to be sending out, I did send out a link, I don't know if you all can see it, to the Harvard implicit bias test. Okay. And I did want to also reemphasize a point that Professor Redfield made. She has a book coming out. It's called Extending Justice, Strategies to Increase Inclusion and Reduce Bias, Strategies to Increase Inclusion and Reduce Bias. And you all are so lucky. The book's not out yet, but when it is available, you all will be able to save 20% through July 30th next year, like a year from now, when you order from the publisher, which is cap-press.com. That's Carolina Press, cap-press.com, and then use the code EXTEND. So it's not available yet, but when it is available, and I think the museum will also send out the code to all the attendees as well. So I'm looking forward to the book. Professor Redfield, when is the book going to be out again?
Oh, if only I knew for sure, Mary. I'm hoping the end of October.
Yeah, so soon, not like months from now.
No.
So you will have almost a year to get a 20% discount. So, right. Well, following up on our conversation, the women in the movie, and I think women in general, some people, just to be devil's advocate, would say, okay, there are all these problems exist. Some of them are more explicit, some are more implicit, some are very subtle things, which I think in other discussions have been called microaggressions. But why don't the women just speak up or say something sooner? What do you say to that, Professor Redfield?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think one is a tendency that we have to think it's our fault. So if the dean says good morning, this is a random example, okay? If the dean says good morning to the 4 guys who are preceding you around the rotunda and then just doesn't speak to you, do you think that's because you did something wrong? Likely you will think that. If everybody's going out for lunch, but you're not invited, you're not on the email chain, all these small slights, microaggressions, as they're sometimes called, micro messages, as they're sometimes called. I think we tend to turn that in on ourselves and say, well, if only I'd had a better idea, if only I'd offered to chair that committee, if only, when the reality is it's not about you. And so I think that for me, this work on implicit bias has shown me that the person who's sending those messages to me may or may not intend them. Odds are doesn't intend them. But nevertheless, I feel them in a negative way. And it's not about me. It's about him. And so I think that's part of the reason that we turn it in on ourselves. And then it becomes self-perpetuating. We're also afraid how we will be perceived if we complain, right? We're afraid of, as one of the women in the, Rochelle puts it, we're afraid of the angry Black women trope, right? We're afraid of that. We're afraid we'll be perceived that way. We know that women are supposed to be nurturing and caring. They're not supposed to be confrontational, and we don't want to be perceived as the confronting woman. So all those things, I think, play into it. The other thing that's very real in academia, especially, and in other analogous ways in other places, but in academia, is the power, the huge power that senior professors have over new folks, right? So the young woman who was the earth science person in Antarctica who was just brutally abused by the senior scientist there, he says to her explicitly, you'll never get another job, right? You'll never get more funding. And she knows that to be true because he's got the job, he's got the funding, he's got the reputation. And without that, she can't make it on her own. So I think that's the other piece of it. And so it's very, very hard to get yourself into a place where you're willing to take that on.
Yeah, and I think you kind of mentioned the trope of angry Black woman. There are these stereotypes for different types of women. I mean, there's the angry Black women, and then African-American women may say, I don't want to become the stereotype. And then for Asian women, they have the opposite, that their stereotype is that they're too quiet, they're too demure. How could they be assertive? I think for Native American women, there's probably just the thought that they're probably not equal players. They're not, more of a background type of person. You think of some of the famous Native American women in history, even though they may have, they probably were strong, resilient women, the way their stories are told in history are example. I'll think of Sacagawea and Pocahontas. Both were used as guides for white men to help white men with their expedition when they probably could have led the expedition themselves, but were not given the chance. Well, that kind of brings up another thought. You kind of mentioned, we've talked about the small numbers of Native American women and other women of color in these situations, and the failure to speak up because of different things. I know there's this thought of groupthink. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so groupthink is a term that was made up, I guess, by a psychologist, Irving Janis, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy is reported to have said himself, how could we have been so stupid, right? So I don't know about you all, but I have this sort of image of a picture of the room, the war room, where they're all deciding what to do. And there's nobody stupid in that room, right? Let's be quite clear on that. There is nobody stupid in that room. And so Janis studied that interaction at great length, and he developed this description called groupthink, which is we all think like everybody else, especially the leader. So if I'm in charge and I say, well, let's do thus and such, the next folks are more likely to say, yes, let's do thus and such than not. And if the group all is alike anyway, if they're all similar in background, similar in education, similar in perspective, then all the more likely they are to agree with the point that one of them makes, the leader makes. And no one asks the really hard question. Nobody goes back and says, well, did we think about thus and such? Or remember when we said thus and such? We should remember that. Nobody does that anymore. So it's called groupthink. And there's another version of it called the, I like this one better. It's got a good story, called the Abilene Paradox, right? And it's a story about the father-in-law. It says to his family, oh, let's all get in the car and go down to Abilene and have dinner. And his wife says, oh, okay, let's do that. And then the whole family, everybody's piling on. They're all going to drive to Abilene to have dinner. And, it's 53 miles and it's 104 degrees out and there's no air conditioning in the car and the food isn't that good at the diner. And they come back and somebody sort of ventures, well, that was fun. And then somebody else says, oh, it's horrible. I didn't want to go anyway. And then one after the other, they all tell their reasons why they didn't want to go anyway. But nobody was feeling self-confident enough or comfortable enough to say, well, maybe it's not a good idea. And I think what happens is when we get in a group where everybody basically looks like us, has the same background as us, thinks like us, that's what happens. We either drive to Abilene or we blow up Cuba. We don't make a thoughtful decision because we've cut people out of the discussion and we don't hear them. And so it's another aspect of invisibility, and it's really problematic. We miss our leaders, right? We miss the chance to have other leaders. So maybe this is the minute where I get to do the tiny bit of introduction of you, Mary, and say how wonderful it is to have you be the incoming president of the American Bar Association, and what a tribute it is to you and your fortitude and courage. So it's all good news for all of us.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, I guess I failed to mention that part of my background.
Okay.
I'm president-elect of the
it.
American Bar Association, and I'm the first Native American woman to hold that role. And I can see, in a lot of ways, it really isn't about me, but I see that me being there, what I represent, not me specifically, is inspiring to young Native attorneys for them to say, oh, I can do this too. I mean, I think it was similar that a lot of African Americans felt when Barack Obama became president.
Yes.
It was a powerful symbol, and it's true. You raised the issue that it's through these both explicit and implicit biases that we're failing to include thought leaders, other people in the discussion who could make significant contributions. But it's really hard to solve problems if you don't have the right people at the table. I mean, I was listening to a discussion earlier today, actually, on addressing climate change. And sure, we have COP 25, COP 26, 27 coming, and a lot of the developed countries have set metrics to get to zero carbon emissions. But until the entire world, most notably, the continent of Africa, and one person pointedly said, stop referring to Africa as a country, it's a continent, until everyone is included, we together will not be able to address climate change. And that's, I guess, an analogy to not having women and people of color in the STEM fields. So, just following up on that, these are all aspects of group bias. So could you kind of explain that? And then I think after that, we've talked about identifying the problem, but I think after your answer on this, we'll kind of go to how can we solve these issues?
Okay.
Talk about a little bit about the affinity bias and group bias.
So we've seen a lot of examples of this already, starting with Nancy Hopkins' description, but also the cartoons, right? We just tend to like people who are in our in-group, however we define that group, right? And we also, there's another bias that I think also becomes relevant in terms of who we want to include and why we perhaps don't include Native American scientists or other scientists who are not mainstream. And that is this idea of confirmation bias. So confirmation bias means you have an expectation of something, and then you see the evidence that supports your expectation, and you tend to dismiss the evidence that doesn't support your expectation. And there's really just an iconic study on this that I want to share with folks, done by Dr. Erin Reeves, who, this is a study with lawyers, but she could have done it, I think, with any profession, where she gave identical memos to partners in a law firm to review and mark up and score. And the only difference in the memos was one had on the top Thomas Meyer African American, and the other had on the top Thomas Meyer Caucasian. And so the scores were very different, very different. And the scores were different on things like punctuation, right? Things that aren't discretionary, not style, things that are really not discretionary. And the comments, one for the white young man, the comment was, has potential. And for the African American young man was, well, how did he ever get into NYU? Right. So the differences were quite extreme. And so Dr. Reeves puts it this way: people started out with an assumption that people of color were poor writers. And guess what? They were poor writers. So this is those two biases play in together in harmful ways. And for women in particular, they suffer from what some folks call the double bind. You just have to do everything twice as good as the other person. You have to work twice as hard. And if you make a mistake really rough on you, it does not get dismissed as, oh, too bad. We knew she couldn't do it, right? So those are all the kinds of biases, implicit and explicit, that play out, that keep women and Indigenous women and women of all kinds from taking what I would consider their fair half share place in this scientific community.
Well, yeah, and you quoted that study by Dr. Aaron Reeves about submitting writing samples of different people. And some people may say, oh, well, that was a study, but I actually have a friend, and I think you know him too, Professor Redfield, Lawrence Baca, and I'm not telling anything out of school because he tells this story himself publicly. He was and this has been like 30 or 40 years ago, but that's not that long, really. He was the first Native American attorney hired right out of law school to work as an attorney at the Department of Justice through what they call the honors program. And he went to Harvard, and he would have his supervisors. The supervisors have to review all the junior attorneys' briefs before they file them in court. And every time Lawrence wrote a brief, his supervisor would pull out the red pen and really mark it up quite a bit. So one time Lawrence decided to test this theory.
He did his own experiment.
He did his own experiment because his supervisor always told him that Native Americans are spoken word people. They're not really written word people. So Lawrence, at one point, after many rounds of this and being frustrated, because like I said, he has a Harvard law degree like many of his colleagues, he asked one of his white male colleagues to submit the brief that he had written under his own name, his colleague's name. And miraculously, the brief was wonderful.
Wow, that's a great example, isn't it? It's a miserable example, but it's a very telling example.
Yeah, and then Lawrence has a great sense of humor. He said that after that, he went into the supervisor's office and closed the door, and they had a discussion of words that you really shouldn't be using at the Department of Justice. And there was loud voices and words used. But then Lawrence, using his sense of humor, said, yes, we had an argument, but I'm pretty sure I won because Native Americans are an oral people. Yeah. Well, we've talked about the problem. I want to finish our discussion talking about solutions. So there's all these biases, but what can we do about it, Professor Redfield?
Yeah, there are all these biases, and what can we do about it? And the story about Lawrence is a good one. Well, one thing is we can have some humor and use our humor to help lighten a situation up if we can. When I reflected on that question after watching the film, I would say that we have to be motivated. So Nancy Hopkins was motivated. She was angry. She was right to be angry. She was angry. She eventually discussed her work with her fellow MIT professors. Much to my surprise, they didn't know each other, the women on the MIT faculty. So that's the next thing we can do about it. We can find our colleagues and our allies and recognize, just like I said before, it's not all about you. It helps you to understand it's not all about you if you can connect with women who have had or similar experiences, and you can sort of say, yeah, it's not about you either, right? It's a little easier for me to see, Mary, that you are brilliant than it might be for me to see that I'm brilliant, right? So that kind of connection is an important thing that we can do about it. The other thing in particular situations that we can do about it is to collect our data, right? To understand. I mean, some folks go to meetings and count how many times they're interrupted, right? So women go to meetings and they keep count of how many times they're interrupted compared to men who are interrupting them or we're talking over them. So that's really a little tiny piece of data. But the data is really going to be important to us. The statistics you started with, Mary, are really important to us. And then there are specific strategies that we can learn about how our brains work, right? So to interrupt implicit biases. And so that means we have to learn them, take the implicit association test that we talked about, but we have to also become trained on how to interrupt them. And I would say before we go on even a little bit more on this, that implicit bias is sort of in vogue now, right? It's in the press, and it's a little bit like when Forrest Gump came out. You can't go out on a cocktail party if you hadn't seen the movie, right? That kind of idea. And it's become common, I think, to criticize training about implicit bias and to say it's just a lot, it doesn't work. But that's not true. And the reason we know it's not true is because women scientists proved it for us. The women in the universities did the work, did the data, did the training, did the measurements, measured how their departments changed. So I think we can feel confident that if we set to work on this, we can in fact see a change being made. Not as much change as I think we might hope, but change being made. And I think if we work with each other on it, we can have support that we need. And maybe I'll add one more piece before I turn it back to you. The other thing is to recognize we will need allies, right? So when the women scientists at MIT did their report and they gathered all their data and they finally brought it to the president of MIT, they weren't expecting much from him. But he, to their great surprise, became their staunchest ally and said, well, you're right. And MIT is going to change. And at that time, the provost at MIT was a fellow named Robert Brown, who then became the president of Boston University and was the president who fired Dr. Marchand, the guy who had so abused the young woman in Antarctica. So you do need allies, but you also need to do your homework.
Yeah, that concept of allyship is very important, I think, to make change, no matter what kind of change you want to make. But I'm going to push back and I'm going to be a devil's advocate because certainly women and people of color, need to take control of their own careers and things like that. That's certainly true. But I know, for instance, I think we're all familiar, a few years ago, Sheryl Sandberg came out with her book, Lean In. And that book was criticized in some respects in that it put all the onus on the women to make the change rather than have organizational change or culture change kind of overall, rather than each individual woman charting her own destiny, thinking about, for instance, we see it, I'll give an example outside the STEM fields as well. We have seen recently the discrimination that occurs in women's sports. We saw it with the women's soccer team where just even their practice area, the men had all the top of the line equipment, a huge
facility. Like those fish tanks, right?
Yeah. And the women just had a very small area with like one piece of equipment. And then the women's soccer team, they were world champions, and the men had not had a championship. And the women only were able to get equal pay earlier this year after many years of fighting, many years of contentious litigation. And that's from women who actually have more of a platform, have more of a voice than the average woman in the workplace. So what can be done to kind of change the overarching structures rather than putting a lot of the onus on the women and people of color?
Well, it's a hard question, right? And I think part of the reason it's a hard question is that even though the data is out there, many folks turn away from it and don't want to believe it. So the data on the advantages of having a diverse workforce, diverse decision-making group, diverse jury, diverse brainstorming group, anything you want to say, the data is really overwhelming about how that makes for better decisions, more creative decisions, more profitable organizations, study after study after study. So I would, in my naive way, think that would be enough, right? That the people who are in decision-making positions could say, oh, look, I could make more money. Let's just get to that. Never mind social justice. I could make more money if I did it this way. And still, it doesn't happen. So it's really, what do you call it? The $64 million question. I mean, it's a hard question. But I think that I agree totally with you that it shouldn't be on us to fix it. On the other hand, pushing back again, on the other hand, if we aren't the ones who are creating some reason to fix it, it won't get fixed.
Yeah, and I guess I would say, I think all of us, we need to demand that our leaders feel that these issues are important. And I think that concept of allyship is very important because when a diverse group of people is saying that something is unfair or unjust, that's a powerful message. And I think we're seeing that, we saw that, like for instance, after George Floyd, we saw workers at many companies banding together and saying, I don't want to be part of an organization that doesn't value every person's voice, every person's life. And Black Lives Matter, and so that was, I think, a powerful example of allyship. So there are things we can do. I think of a story too where it's kind of funny because even women, I think some women who want to help other women, I guess they get so locked into the way things are always done. I remember listening to a panel of women managing partners of law firms, and one woman said every year when different classes of attorneys were up to make partner, the women, not surprisingly, made partner in less percentages than the male colleagues. And one year, she just decided to reach out and meet with some of the individual women and coach them on what they needed to do to make partner. And surprisingly, more women made partner that year. So sometimes it's just the people at the top seeing what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear. I've been on a task force with the criminal justice section looking at women and why they leave the practice of criminal law. And one of the messages that was repeated everywhere we went was they don't know the rules, right? They don't know what it takes to get promoted. They don't know what the standard is. And maybe there isn't a standard, but I think your story suggests that there are ways and familiar things that we can learn. I mean, the trouble with that, and Rochelle talks about this in the movie, is that we are also spending so much energy trying to deal with all that we're not doing our work, right? So for all the time that I have to spend dealing with the inappropriate email or the students who complain about me but don't complain about any of my male colleagues, or all the time I have to spend doing that, I'm not doing my teaching. I'm not doing my research. I'm not publishing. I'm not doing the work that would eventually get me enough points to be promoted. So that's another problem that you raise when you say it can't just be on us to fix it.
the women who were depicted in the film, Dr. Hopkins and the others, they were actually at the top of their field. They had already gotten their PhDs. They were experts. But a lot of these things, I know we address it in the Carolina North Smith Foundation. It starts very early. It starts when women and girls and people of color are younger. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, Professor Redfield?
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is the pipeline, right, to the professions, to science, to medicine. And it does start really early. And to this day, you can go look on Amazon for toys and you can see those that are described for boys. That would be the construction toys and the science toys, and those that are described for girls. And I think to this day that's a little shocking. And so the media gets to us at a very early age. And there was the Gap advertisement. I don't know if you remember this one, where they were promoting the little girl's sweatshirt as the social butterfly, and the little boy's sweatshirt as the boy genius, right? And so we have these ideas we absorb them from all the way around us from really a very early age. And I think that it's on all of us to object to that, right? All of us in our families and in our connections to object to that. But then the whole education system does the same thing, right? There are assumptions that are made about children of color and more so where they're women, that they're just not cut out for this, right? And so they're not encouraged. And if they don't, as is often the case, see somebody who looks like them doing the work, then it's all that much harder. So I think the work that your foundation's doing is just critical, just absolutely critical to get to children at a young age and show them that they are competent, that they are potentially brilliant or already brilliant, who knows, and not fall into those biases where we assume implicitly the opposite kind of stereotype. But one of the other things that we saw in the movie that for me was also very discouraging was even when these women made it through the pipeline, and there they were enrolled in engineering program, the beginning of their program, there were 100 of them, and at the end there were 7. So there's also a disproportionality in who sticks it out. And I think that's for lack of support, right? Lack of having somebody who looks like you, lack of having somebody who mentors you. And so that's another big piece of allyship, a piece of mentorship for those folks who've already made it in their professions. And it's on all of us.
Yeah. And I think I'll say maybe some of the younger people out there watching may say, oh, Professor Redfield and Mary, they're talking about things that happened
they're old
years ago or whatever. No, things are still happening. And, I'll just use my own example. You mentioned that I'm going to be president of the American Bar Association next year. And I ran against a white male. And there were not a lot, but more than one person who actually did not feel ashamed to say to my face that I don't look like an ABA president.
Yes.
And what I found is that I think, I know myself included, and probably a lot of women of people of color, they think, oh, well, things are different now, things are improving. But I find that when women and people of color, and I saw it in my own situation, as long as you're kind of in the accepted lane that people expect you to be in, I mean, yeah, it's more accepted that obviously, women are going to college and law school, but when you try to go to the top position and you're putting yourself out there, stretching beyond what women or people of color have done, that's when these biases come out. When you're, I mean, I guess that's why part of the reason, in this country, you look around the world and there's so many countries that have had women leaders, but here we are in the United States. We've never had a woman president. And, for the first time, I mean, it's taken over 200 years to even have a woman vice president.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it's such a self-perpetuating circle and argues again for allies and colleagues that support you. One of the Rochelle in the movie talks about she's speaking at a conference and she talks about how it's not comfortable for her, that the space is not comfortable for her, that less than a quarter of the speakers are women and even fewer are women of color, and that before she went, everyone told her to change her hair and get a different dress and remake herself to look more like what a conference speaker looks like, to sort of build off your you don't look like an ABA president. And that raises all the questions about whether or not and when and where and how we can be our authentic selves. You know, I that's what I hope. I'm a fairly new grandmother. My granddaughter is about to be 3, and that's my best and greatest hope for her, that she doesn't feel anything but the right to be her authentic self. And I think that all of us are working towards that.
Did get a question. The question is to us as young girls, did you feel you had a specific gift and that you were determined and free to accomplish your dreams? I'll let you answer that question.
Oh, wow. I felt like I was smart. And I did well in school, but I also suffered, I guess, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. So I think I suffered from just a lack of knowledge and a lack of mentorship and a lack of awareness. And I think that I didn't have like some of the women in the film, this dream to be an Antarctic explorer or an astronaut I didn't have that kind of dream. So I guess nobody stopped me because I didn't have that kind of dream. And when I look back on it, I wonder why I didn't, right? That my world was pretty narrow and the things I saw that women did were be mothers or be teachers, right? Sort of that. I didn't even see too many medical people, so I must have had nurse in my vocabulary at the time. But so I guess I thought I had a special gift, but I wasn't helped to be creative with it. And I would also say that my guidance counselor, I remember this to this minute. I'm glad you asked that question because, Mary, I want to tell you the story. I remember her saying, well, don't bother to take that science class. You won't be any good at it. I remember that, right? So the answer, I guess, to the question is yes, I think I had a special gift. And no, I don't think very many people helped me to achieve it. And then I would just add on to that, I think that ending up going to law school, I've become, I'm a good researcher, I'm a good writer, I'm a good talker. And I've tried really hard to use that gift to make sure that other girls have more options, I guess I'd put it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you ended up telling a guidance counselor story because I have one too. But I think the one kind of overall comment I'll make about it before I talk about myself is that I've thought about this, and one person can make such a difference to encourage a young girl or even, boys, obviously, too, and parents and teachers. I know so many people can just say that it was one teacher who inspired them and believed in them and set them on their path. And so I guess I was lucky because similar to you, neither of my parents went to college. And in fact, my dad did not even graduate high school. And so I'm a first generation college and then certainly law school. In fact, I can say that I probably didn't even meet a lawyer until after college. I just didn't know any of them. And but my dad, even despite having not gone to graduating high school, he always encouraged me to get good grades and to do well and to not to focus on my schoolwork. And I think that was a powerful incentive. But similar to you, I think we talked about earlier in this talk about people can have the ability, but if you don't have the mentors or the sponsors or allies to tell you, because every situation, whether it's school or the workplace, there's unwritten rules. And yeah, I could say similar to you, I often didn't know the unwritten rules and opportunities that might be available. And like you, in high school, I actually was number 2 in my class, and there was a certain scholarship that anyone from Illinois, I grew up in Illinois, was entitled to if you got above a certain score on a test. And I had gotten way above that score. And then later I found out that several people in my high school class were getting that scholarship. And I was not wealthy. And I asked my guidance counselor, why didn't you tell me that I was eligible for this scholarship? And I can't even remember what her specific answer was, but it was kind of a cop-out. And that's like an example where I was...
But you probably didn't need it.
Well, I mean, I needed the money. The money would have been nice. But it's just an example how one teacher, one guidance counselor, one just parent telling their child, you can do what you want, can work wonders. We did get another question, and this one's to both of us again. What would a 9-year-old Sarah and a 9-year-old Mary say about careers?
Who knew? Who knew?
Yeah, I think I would say to myself, I think probably the biggest thing that holds me back is lack of confidence. And I would tell myself at 9 to be more confident and to not be so hard on myself. Things will work out. They may not work out exactly as you envisioned them or you originally wanted them, but they usually work out the way they should. So it might be very hard and painful getting there, but when you look back, you'll say, oh yeah, that this is actually probably better than what I wanted. We're getting close to the end. We still have a few more minutes. I see that Charlotte has popped back in. So I will ask you, Professor Redfield, for your last words and takeaways for the audience.
Well, I popped back in because you're delightful. And, I always think about, my 9-year-old Charlotte, what she would.
And what would she say?
Well, I knew that I made it when I was showing outdoor cinema at the base of the Space Needle. I mean, 9-year-old Charlotte's like, whoa, that's pretty good. Really, it's just always lead with your gift in your heart, and the universe will open those doors for you. And that's pretty much it. I mean, both of you, I am just so honored for you to join us today. How delightful. And your accomplishments are amazing. I know you're taking time out of the Clinton Initiative today. And I hope one day we can have a real time together. This is the first cultural celebration I got to hug Dan Wildcat. I've never gotten to grab you, Mary, and the time's coming.
Yes, it is.
All right. My blessing. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I will let Dr. Redfield do a final takeaway for the audience.
Well, I had given some thought to this earlier, but having listened to particularly your last remarks, Mary, I guess I have a slightly different thought than I had planned. I think that one's self-confidence is the most important thing. The belief that you can do something, that when you're a success, you're not an imposter. There's a whole thing called an imposter syndrome. You don't really deserve it. You don't really belong there. And for me, I didn't have much self-confidence. I'm also a Yankee, where my heritage, my cultural heritage is ask for nothing, expect nothing. I wouldn't have gone out and asked for attention, right? So I guess my takeaway is that all of us, those of us who are at the beginning of our careers, and those of us who have gone further along, that we recognize the need for self-confidence for ourselves, and we encourage others to have that self-confidence to succeed. I mean, one of the things that sometimes I talk about in training is micro messages, these small messages. So, for example, I just might say, "Oh, that was a good idea you had, Mary." And that's a right. Instead of you being talked over, I just say, "Oh, that was a good idea Mary had." So maybe my message is, let's all leave this conversation with a whole slew of those small messages that we're going to pass on to help other people feel that self-confidence that they need and feel the ability to be successful, and then they will.
Yeah.
That's my message.
Well,
That wasn't what I was expecting to say, Mary, but that's it.
No, that's great. And I mean, I think some of the takeaways are that just to be aware of even everybody has on the unconscious biases, but the strength of allyship, because none of us got to where we are alone. We always, it takes a village, or for natives, it takes a tribe. And just thank everyone again for joining us today for this wonderful conversation, and for the museum and the wonderful Charlotte and her staff allowing us to be part of the cultural celebration. And remember, you can get a discount on Professor Redfield's upcoming book, Extending Justice. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you all, we have 2 more days to go, so tune in.
We will.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You too.
Our pleasure.